Today I want to talk about trauma because whether you realize it or not, you are dealing with that most of the time. Now, for our purposes, there's big trauma and then there's little trauma. And much of the work that we do in our sessions with clients really falls under the little trauma label. Basically, the child is just too young to make sense of what's happening. And when that's the case, the child will just automatically interpret the situation erroneously. And that doesn't make it silly or wrong. What was happening was too much for the child. They weren't able to make sense of it. They didn't understand. They felt confused or scared. And by the way, confusion is a sign that you may just have located the ISE. The younger the child is, the more likely their first response to the situation that is often becomes frightening will be confusion. They don't know how to make sense of it. So just keep that in mind. So that's the first response that the child has to a new situation. There's something in the situation, they don't understand it, and if it feels threatening, then that qualifies as trauma. But trauma is not what you think. Now, according to Dr. Robert Scare, who is an expert in trauma and the author of The Body Bears the Burden, which I highly recommend you read, and also The Trauma Spectrum. If you're a healthcare worker in the medical field, definitely read The Trauma Spectrum. It's very important material for you to understand. So what Dr. Scare states is that trauma is the result of any situation that was perceived as a threat to well-being or to survival, and it occurred when the person was in a state of defenselessness. So they weren't able to control the situation. Obviously, that covers a lot of territory in childhood. And the younger the child is, the more helpless they are. So the more likelihood there is of trauma occurring. And that's what we find when we track back. Now, to the adult mind, events that were traumatic to the child can really seem silly and illogical and really just no big deal. But to the child, any situation that involves feelings of being unsafe or unprotected or not being able to make sense of things, that brings in that old brain response, which triggers a fight or flight stress response in the body. So any situation where the child is feeling frightened, shocked, even intense surprise, where the child is feeling powerless or overwhelmed, that qualifies as trauma, and you need to treat it as such. Any situation where the child is perceiving that she or he is being rejected, so the perception of rejection, qualifies as a survival threat because a child knows it can't survive on its own. It needs to be accepted in order to be taken care of by primary caregivers especially. But just the perception of rejection, it can trigger survival fears, and that's a stress response. Any situation that causes confusion, that's a survival threat because a child needs to be able to figure out how things work in its environment, and so that's a threat to survival if it's not able to make sense of things. If the child lacks the resources that it needs to take care of it and meet its own needs, then that is a survival threat. Not fitting in, you can find this with very early age within the family of origin, and maybe later you can find that in school. The first day of school can be an issue for a lot of people. So not fitting in, that is also a survival threat because members of the tribe who get cast out, they're not going to make it. We need a tribe to survive. It says, there's an old saying, an African saying, that it takes a community to raise a child. I think it takes a community to provide security for the child. And so not fitting in is really a big source of trauma for some people. And according to Brené Brown, it's a source of shame. Now, a child that is put on a feeding schedule can develop what's called a starvation conflict in German New Medicine. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it biologically. If you can't get food when you're hungry, you'll die. And so this is just a biological fear that comes up. This is a threat to survival. Any situation where the child feels abandoned or neglected are perceived as life-threatening, because we need connection to survive. We need to be around other people. We need them to take care of us to survive, especially the younger the child is. Trauma comes down to classic fear conditioning. It's stimulus response. This is old brain stuff. It doesn't involve any thinking. There's no reasoning involved in this. Any perception of threat makes an impression on the brain. We're hardwired for this. So what happens is that if there's a perception of threat, the brain sends a signal throughout the entire nervous system of the body. And the body then stores that information for future reference. This is survival programming. We're learning from our environment how to take care of ourselves and how to get our needs met. And so this is the basis of biological conflicts that you find in German New Medicine. Now, this is important. It's not the trauma that's the problem. The problem is that the client has not come up with a solution. The subconscious mind hasn't been able to resolve the problem. And so subconsciously, that event, that situation, that problem isn't over. It's happening still. The person has become what's called kindled by the event. So kindling is like setting up for a fire. It's laying all those little sticks of wood, and then all it takes is a match to set it off. So in hypnosis theory, we call that sensitization. In psychology, it's called priming, like priming a pump. We call it the initial sensitizing event, which is the kindling event. And that's the first time that there was that perception that caused a disruption in the energy system of the body. That's EFT talk there for you. So similar events then act as reminders. So we've already learned the information that gets stored in this survival system, and then subsequent events are just reminders of that initial experience, that learning that went in the first time. And those subsequent events can then act to re-stimulate the memory, which holds the original trauma, which, in and of itself is bad enough, but it's much worse than that. Because unconsciously, the subconscious mind continues to ruminate over and over and over again, trying to come up with a solution to the problem. And that's the conflict. It can't find a solution because it's still operating with the resources of the child at the age at which that event happened. And obviously, it didn't have the resources that it needed. So ruminating compounds the problem. It's going over and over and over the same thing. It's like putting more wood on it. It's like, adding to the problem. It's making it stronger, and eventually something happens. Eventually it ignites, it bursts into flames, and that's when symptoms arise, and that's when the client starts looking for a solution. They start looking for an external relief to that symptom. But the symptom isn't the problem. Symptoms are not the problem. The problem is a story. It's a life experience that becomes a story over a person's lifetime. And it may or may not even be true. Remember, it's just based on the perceptions at the age at which it occurred. It's a perception of threat. It's perceived as a threat to survival while in a state of helplessness, so not having the resources that are needed to be able to resolve it. Now, the helplessness may be true. I mean, if you're an infant, you are pretty helpless. If you're a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old or even a 5-year-old, there's a certain element of helplessness because you're dependent on others for your care and for your well-being. So a threat to survival is obviously untrue because the client is still here. This is the point we want to hammer home, is that they might have perceived it as a threat to survival, but obviously that perception was untrue because they're still here. They survive. Even the worst situations of abuse, this is the bottom line. You lived. You're still here. But the subconscious mind doesn't know that. It still thinks it's happening. It doesn't know that there isn't more hurt on its way. Now, big T trauma is different from little t trauma. Big T trauma is like this one-time event. It's like a crisis. Or it could be a series of crises, but it's got lots of energy in it. It's like a big explosion. And what happens is that the person becomes hypersensitive and can be easily triggered by similar situations. And this is often called post-traumatic stress. Not necessarily post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a medical condition, but just post-traumatic stress. So they keep getting re-triggered. So a common coping strategy for post-traumatic stress is dissociation. This is something you want to look for in the regression. Dissociation is disconnecting emotionally. It's like deking out emotionally, and it's just a way of coping with feeling out of control. If there's nothing you can do, you know, it's a flight response, but if there's nowhere to go, then the flight is inside. So you want to watch for that with clients who are seem to be kind of spaced out, or who have really low affect, because that can be a sign of an unresolved trauma within, whether it's a little trauma or a big trauma. If it's a little trauma, then it's usually an indication that there's been lots of reinforcement through their life. So just something to keep in mind, that if your client is dissociated, if they're kind of closed off or shut down, then something happened to make them that way, and you want to find out what that something might be. Okay, so that's it for this time. I hope you found something in today's message that is going to help you in your sessions, give you a little more clarity about what to look for when you're doing the uncovering process, and just a different way to think about trauma, because we're not practicing psychology here. What we're doing is we're helping people to just recover their sense of self by looking at the events that caused them to lose that. So be sure to leave your comments, your questions on the forum. I want to hear from you. I'm here to help you. And so let me know what you got and what you need. I'm here for you. Okay, until next time, I'm Wendie signing off. See you soon.